A very good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this OFSI webinar this morning. My name is Mike Green and I'm from the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation in Her Majesty's Treasury. First of all, apologies for the last minute change of link, which has brought you all here this morning. We were reliably informed that given the number of people who'd signed up, the previous one may have wobbled and indeed fallen over. So hopefully we're now on safe ground. Which is good because in terms of batting order this morning, we've got Henry Eads from OFSI, who you may remember from previous webinars about the OFSI consolidated list format changes, and he's going to run us through the change in reporting obligations for relevant firms. So he's going to give a short presentation of around 15 minutes or so, and we will have a short time for a question and answer session after that. On Teams Live, you'll see the question and answer session functionality at the top. If you click through into that and submit any questions that arise off the back of Henry's presentation, then we'll hopefully get to as many of those as we can at the end. And then to get the obvious questions out the way before we start as well, to hopefully question those in the Q&A, we will be making a recording of this session available afterwards as well for a short time on OFSI's gov.uk pages. So we will send the link out for that once this morning's presentation is finished. Without further ado, I shall hand over to Henry and we'll see you back here for the Q&As afterwards. Thanks, Henry.
Good evening or good day, depending on where you are. Yeah, thank you all for coming along today to have a chat about the upcoming legislation. So Mike will just flick on to the next slide, and this is really what we're going to run a new area. So we're going to do a very quick recap on who OFSI are and sort of a bit of financial sanctions 101, and that's some really useful context to the reporting obligations themselves. We'll then run through the reporting obligations as well as what the changes are to relevant firms, and then sort of the what and the how of reporting, that practical side of it, as people often find that quite useful. And then, as Mike has said, we'll hopefully have time at the end for a quick Q&A on any outstanding questions you may have. And as Mike said, those can be put in the Q&A functionality at the top of your Teams meeting. So to begin with, we'll have a look at who OFSI are. We are the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, which is a bit wordy, so we'll go with OFSI for the rest of the presentation. So we're part of the Treasury, and we are the authority for implementing financial sanctions in the UK. We do many things, but sort of some of our core functions are listed there on the screen. So we try to assist people comply with financial sanctions. So we publish guidance documents, we run webinars such as this, and we publish lists of those subject to financial sanctions. For example, there, the consolidated list of asset freeze targets, which has a list of everybody who's subject to an asset freeze under UK sanctions, including those subject to UN sanctions. We also consider applications for licenses. They allow otherwise prohibited activity to take place in specific circumstances. And we also monitor compliance with financial sanctions, assessing suspected breaches, and where necessary, taking action on those. We have powers to issue monetary penalties in relation to this, which you may or may not be familiar with. If you'd like any more information on this, I can definitely recommend that you go to OFSI's gov.uk page. This is online, it's very easy to find. You can just put OFSI in your search engine of choice, and it should be one of the first things that comes up. And it's got a whole host of material, including the guidance I mentioned above, on what OFSI does and how we do it. So we'll now talk about a bit of financial sanctions 101. In terms of who has to abide by financial sanctions, well, it's all persons within the territory and the territorial sea of the UK, and all UK persons wherever they are in the world. Now, the term persons here doesn't just refer to individuals, it refers to both legal and natural persons. So people like you and me on this call, as well as the entities that we all work for. The most common form of financial sanction that you'll read about in the news or elsewhere is an asset freeze. Asset freezes apply to specific individuals and entities. We refer to these as designated persons, and this is a term that's going to come up later in the presentation, and it's quite an important one. So they apply to these specific people, and they prohibit certain activities relating to the funds and economic resources of the target. It's also worth noting that asset freezes extend to entities that are owned or controlled by those designated persons too. And then finally, breaching a prohibition or failing to comply with a financial sanctions obligation is an offence, and that may result in a criminal prosecution or a monetary penalty, as I mentioned earlier. And just quickly to say that Financial sanctions aren't just about asset freezes. While they're the most common, some of our financial sanctions regimes do have other measures. So, for example, you've probably read about various Russia sanctions recently on various sectors of the Russian economy and various activities. And these are also applicable to the Belarus regime, North Korea regime, and Syria regime, just to name a few. So we'll move on to talk about the reporting obligations themselves. From that slide there, you might have got the gist that financial sanctions are just about what you're not allowed to do, but in fact there are obligations as well. And the one we're going to be talking about today, obviously, is the reporting obligations. What these basically require is for relevant firms, which is defined in the legislation, to inform OFSI of certain information as soon as practicable. And we'll run through what that certain information is in a bit. In terms of what does as soon as practicable mean, well, this can vary depending on the case, but ultimately should not delay an effective response. So, for example, you may want to consider an initial partial disclosure to OFSI and then follow up with a fuller, more detailed disclosure at a later date if necessary. Now, these reporting obligations only apply when the information or other matter on which the knowledge or suspicion is based comes to you in the course of carrying out your business. So, for example, if you've logged off for the day and you're watching TV with your better half, you don't necessarily need to report the fact that you've seen a designated person on the television. However, if the next day you then go to the office and you're checking your company records and do identify that a client is a designated person, you would need to report that. And as in the red text at the bottom there, failing to comply with reporting obligations is an offence which could result in a criminal prosecution or a fine. So those are reporting obligations. We'll now take a look at who these relevant firms are. So reporting obligations apply to relevant firms as defined in the legislation, and it is currently the same across all regimes. So it's the same people no matter whether you're interacting with a designated person under the Russia, Zimbabwe, or chemical weapons regimes. It's the same across all of them. The definition includes a variety of sectors and firms and sole practitioners, for example, most classically, certain financial institutions and legal service providers. Now, the change which has brought us all here today is down to those two bits of secondary legislation on the screen. For your sake and mainly for mine, I won't run through their whole names, but they're there for you to read, and they are available on legislation.gov should you want to take a look. And what these bits of legislation do is essentially they add crypto asset exchange providers and custodian wallet providers to the definition of relevant firm. The full definition of these we'll run through in a second, but again, they can be found in the regulations themselves online should you want to have a look. And just to say that it's effective from the 30th of August, which I believe is the Tuesday after the August bank holiday. So as I said, we'll break down what these actually mean. Again, I won't run through the definition word for word, but it is on the screen there. And this is the definition for a crypto asset exchange provider. Those of you familiar with the money laundering regulations may find this definition familiar because it is based on it. And it is worth noting that within this definition, crypto asset includes a right to or interest in the crypto asset. I'll give a few seconds more to read through that definition should you be interested, and then we'll move on to the custodian wallet provider definition. So the custodian wallet provider definition, again, if you're familiar with the money laundering regulations, this in turn will be familiar to you. And is a firm or sole practitioner that by way of business provides services to safeguard and administer crypto assets on behalf of its customers, or private cryptographic keys on behalf of its customers in order to hold, store and transfer crypto assets. So for completeness, just some definitions from within those. I appreciate we're running through this at a rate of knots, but as I said, the regulations are available online. So should you want to go and sort of revise your understanding, then it is available there. But that's what we mean by crypto asset and money within those definitions. So in terms of what relevant firms need to report, we can break this down into three key areas. The first is that if you know or have reasonable cause to suspect that a person is a designated person, so that's a person subject to an asset freeze. You also need to report information on which that knowledge or suspicion is based, as well as information by which the designated person can be identified. And this is really useful to us. So identifying information could include aliases, addresses, dates of birth, company registration details, This isn't set out in the legislation in terms of what specific identifiers you need to report, but if you're looking for inspiration on what might be useful, you may want to consider the fields of our consolidated list of asset freeze targets, which includes the fields I've just mentioned, as well as other ones which we may find useful, particularly if we don't have that information on the consolidated list. The second is that if you have identified that a customer is a designated person, you need to report the same information as above, so why you think that, as well as how they can be identified, but you also need to report the nature and amount or quantity of any funds or economic resources held. And I'll speak a bit about what we mean by funds and economic resources, but it's a pretty broad term. And once they're frozen, they should be reported to us with the value of when you first recognize that they may be a designated person. And third and finally, but by no means least, if you have reasonable cause to suspect that a person has committed a financial sanctions offence, then you need to report, again, the information on which that knowledge or suspicion is based, but also the information by which the person who's committed the offence and or the designated person involved can be identified. And again, that links back up to my previous point on what sort of information, identifying information, is useful. So we'll move on and talk about what funds and economic resources means. The statutory definition is pretty wide and includes this list here. Again, please note this is not an exclusive list. It's just a few examples, but to demonstrate the variety that within this definition. And of course there I've emboldened crypto assets because they're probably most relevant to this legislative change. And if you'd like more information on the prohibitions around funds and economic resources, this is available in our general guidance, specifically chapter 3. That's available on gov.uk free of charge in readable formats. And then in turn, what do offences look like? Well, this depends on the regulations, but broadly, it may include making funds or economic resources available to a designated person or dealing with their funds or economic resources. We can group this really into the financial prohibitions description. The next two relate to deliberate circumvention and evasion of sanctions. So, you need to report if you have reasonable cause to suspect that a person is conducting activities intended to circumvent sanctions. And then finally, licensing offences. So, for example, OFSI licences will often have a cap on payments, for example, whether that be legal fees or something similar. If, for example, you are a relevant firm and come across a breach of those terms of the Treasury licence, then this too needs to be reported to OFSI under this legislation. In terms of the practicalities of how you report to OFSI, well, we provide a blank reporting form on gov.uk, and you can use this form. It's a bit of a one-stop shop, really, because you can use it to report a suspected designated person, frozen assets, and suspected breaches. And once completed, they should be emailed to us at ofsi@htreasury.gov.uk. When completing the form, please provide all relevant information as required by the regulations. A particularly useful bit of information for you to include is the group ID of the designated person. This is a unique 4 to 5-digit number found in the consolidated list entry for the designated person, and it just helps us to immediately see who this involves and act as appropriate. If you'd like further information on reporting obligations, we have a dedicated chapter in our general guidance, chapter 5, and we will be updating this guidance to reflect the amendment to the definition of relevant firms to make sure it stays up to date with the legislation. Separately, just a quick plug for another bit of OFSI work. This is separate to the reporting obligations, so does not come under the same legal framework, but is related to the reporting of frozen assets. OFSI conducts an annual review of frozen assets with our information powers. We have a dedicated gov.uk page for this, and we will be sending out e-alerts on this when the time comes. But as I said, more information is available on gov.uk, and this is an annual exercise that we've conducted for a few years now and relates to this. And just a caveat there, which I think Mike gave at the start, if you are unsure of your reporting obligations, you should seek independent legal advice. Now, I thought it might be useful to do a quick walkthrough of how you go about finding the form and submitting it, as this is something we have been asked about before. This is OFSI's homepage. The picture with the Ukrainian flag there may change, of course, depending on our most recent blog post. But what you should be interested in is the top right, which has some really useful links, not just to the reporting page, which I've circled there, but also to information on our guidance, our consolidated list, our licensing, and an option to click on a link and subscribe to our free email alerts if you haven't already. So if you click on this link, it'll take you through to our dedicated reporting page. This page contains information and guidance on reporting obligations, similar to what we've covered today. So the who, the what, the when, and the how. And if you scroll down to this page to about the middle, you'll find an empty form for you to download and fill. So that should be on the next slide. And yeah, once you've clicked on that, it'll give you the opportunity to download this Word document. And then I've put a sneak preview on the next slide of the first couple of pages of what it looks like, with the various sorts of fields that are really useful for you to fill out and provide us with. Once complete, again, this should be sent to ofsi@hmtreasury.gov.uk. And as you'll see, the first page of the compliance reporting form does break down sort of what you need to fill out. We have an annex at the end as well with some useful information too. So that's the practicalities of sort of going and finding that form and submitting it. And that's that. That brings us to the end. And I think now we can probably got some time to go through some questions. I've put some useful resources there as well. So if you do have further questions after the event, obviously please do contact us, but you may be able to answer your own questions or find the resources that I've talked about on gov.uk, including our guidance products. And the regulations were laid on the 19th of July, so are already available on legislation.gov, should you want to take a look.
Henry, thank you very much indeed. That was a really useful and swift walk through the new reporting requirements there. Whilst Henry draws breath, I just wanted to reiterate one of the things that he said in terms of the links that are available on OFSI, on gov.uk/OFSI. The e-alerts subscription service, which Henry mentioned, I think the vast majority of people dialing in this morning will already be subscribed to. But if this is relatively new to you and you're not, I can't recommend that highly enough. OFSI sends out regular bulletins to those who are subscribed to our e-alerts on things like the new designations of designated people, which would contain all of the information on designated people, which appears on a consolidated list. Anytime that there's amendment to those details of those designated people, we'll send out an e-alert as well to highlight that to subscribers. And also as well, Henry mentioned the frozen assets, the frozen asset reporting and the annual review of that. We send out reminders in advance of that, so hopefully people know that's coming and can get their ducks in a row well in advance of that deadline. So yes, just another plug for